At the start of my master's degree, I started applying all the information in this video in my essays. Since then, I've been getting consistently over 70, 80, even 90% on my essays over the last year. So for anyone in university or even writing after university, this video is for you to sharpen your writing skills, improve your essay grades, and to avoid all the mistakes that I made. This video will be split into 3 different sections. The first section will explain about the best mindsets to have when writing an essay and the biggest myths about writing. Next, I will give the specific tips and tricks, the secret sauce as it were, to writing an essay. And then lastly, I'll give specific advice in regards to how to structure your essay from the title all the way to the conclusion. When I'm writing an essay, in this case an academic piece of writing, I have one overarching goal: to make it so good that people want to read it. For a student, the hard and difficult truth is that your teachers and lecturers will mark your work, not usually because they want to, but because they are paid to mark your work. However, for those of you that want to get better at writing, and especially in academic writing after university, people won't be paid to read your writing. Now, maybe the goal of getting your writing, especially at university, so good that people want to read it might sound a little bit ambitious, but ultimately, this is the goal that I'm trying to get you towards by the end of this video. It's the goal that I personally aim for. The second mindset I want you to have, or the second myth, is that writing is not about solely communicating your ideas to the reader. That is not the end goal. It's not about showing the reader how much you know. At school, you were told by the teachers to tell them all the facts bouncing around on the inside of your head, or even worse, if you were doing exams like GCSEs and A-levels that we do in the UK, even worse, you were given a question and then you were marked based on an exam board in regards to how many key words you mentioned in that question. This does not set you up for academic writing later on in life. Writing isn't about solely communicating your ideas. No one cares about your ideas specifically. Writing is about changing the minds and the ideas of the people who are reading your writing. To do this though, it's not enough to be knowledgeable in the subject you're talking about. You need to know who you are writing for. What is the target audience? For example, my master's degree is in physiotherapy. If I was writing an essay meant for physiotherapists, I would try to make it valuable to physiotherapists, and we'll get back to the word valuable later on. To give another example, if I am making a YouTube video about essay writing, then I'm not going to talk about the top 5 exercises to improve the size and strength of your calf muscles, because you probably don't really care about that. A lot of the points in this video have been taken from the Chicago writing program. And within this program, there was a main person called Lavie McAdam. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. And there's a main quote from him. His way of wording this situation is, and I'll read directly from the quote, it is, "A function of an academic piece of writing is not to communicate your ideas alone, it's to change the ideas of the existing community." The main factor to success in academia, and this includes academic writing at university, isn't to show how much you know, it's to move the knowledge base forward. And the only way to do that is to change the minds of the people who are reading your work. And the beauty of all of this advice is that even though it's more applicable to those who are writing after university, all the tips and mindsets and things that I discuss in this video, they help you to get way better grades after university. If people are going to check out the Chicago writing program on YouTube, which I highly recommend, they mention 4 key principles to writing. The first one is clarity. Is it clear you know what you are on about? Have you explained it in such a way that the reader knows you know what you're on about? If not, you may need to go over the source material again and have another go at writing. Ultimately, articulating your thoughts in a clear, entertaining and understandable way, especially from an academic point of view, is difficult. I've learned this from my YouTube channel. It's just a skill that needs practice like anything else. The second rule is organization. Is it organized? Is the information you're talking about laid out in a structured and logical manner? Do you use subheadings? Do you use tables and figures to show what you're talking about? Do you go off in tangents a lot in your essay, or do you stick to the main core argument or theme? Thirdly, is it persuasive? Are you mentioning enough valid points in a clear, logical way so that it is convincing and persuasive to the reader that you have a sound argument? Fourthly, and this is the most important one, and it's also why writing is about the readers, is it valuable? And the three main things that dictate whether it is valuable is if it changes how the reader thinks, it changes how they make a decision, how they decide, and it changes what they do. Even if the knowledge or the stuff or the content you're talking about is original, it doesn't guarantee it's going to be valuable. It still needs to be specific to the target audience. So right now, on the 3rd of January, it is currently sunny with a bit of overcast in Lincoln. That is original knowledge, but you probably don't care about that, just to give a very obvious example. So to recap these 4 principles, the information you talk about needs to be specific to the target audience, it needs to be structured in a clear and logical manner, it needs to be written clearly, and you need to have a convincing argument whereby you have enough valid points. And most of all, it needs to be valuable. If the stuff I'm mentioning in this video sounds a bit vague and a bit wooey-washy, then the information, the tips I give later in the video will explain these mindsets and these ways to approach writing. Before I continue in the video, I want to quickly mention that what we're talking about, getting 70, 80, even 90% on essays, it is exceptional if you have got that far. And the rule here is that if you want exceptional results, you need to put in an exceptional amount of effort. Yes, these tips I mentioned will dramatically reduce the amount of time it takes to get a good grade. And that's why I'm doing this video, because I used to spend so much time and it wasn't really worth it in the end. But ultimately, if everyone got 80% on an essay, it wouldn't be a good grade anymore. It would obviously be an average grade at best. So if you want to get 80 or even 90% on an essay, doing these tips doesn't guarantee success, or should I say just listening to this video doesn't guarantee success. You need to implement them, and to do that it takes practice and time. When I finish an essay, or when I'm getting close to finishing it, I will proofread it, I'm not even kidding, at least 4 to 6 times. And that includes the times when I'll get other people to read it as well. So as I said again, just not to go off on a huge tangent here, put in the effort, put in the time, but do it in a smart way, and I guarantee you will see results. Okay, next part of the video. This is about the specific tips and tricks. Get your pen and paper ready, because I'm going to be mentioning loads of different stuff here. The first thing I want to highlight is the fact that each and individual word we use when writing matters. For example, if you're talking about a model, let's just say it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because most people are familiar with that, and you use words stuff like this accepted model. This model is widely accepted or widely used. Though that kind of wording illustrates that the model you're talking about, or just the information you're talking about, is relevant. Or if you start a sentence with interestingly, blah, 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 but obviously be genuine. Only do this at times when you think a fact is genuinely interesting. Or if you find out there's a certain researcher in a field, let's say it's genetics, and you find out that Jones, whatever, is a really well-known researcher, if there's a fact that's reported by him or her, you can say that Jones et al, blah, 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 reported this data. I hope you can kind of see where I'm coming from here. Each and individual word you use illustrates value in some way about the information you talk about, so consider that when writing your essay. Also, one quick extra thing, avoid using the same words. So for example, if you're using the word very common in one time, or just common in general, try and use the word ubiquitous next. You don't have to use big words intentionally, but just try and use a variety of the different words that you use. This tip is probably one of the most important ones in this video. You need to create tension and risk in your essay. One of the best ways to show that your writing has value is to create urgency, is to show that stakes are involved with the information you're talking about, or at least relevant to the wider context. There has to be a problem you are trying to define to the reader. What I'm trying to say is, if someone is reading your essay, what is the benefit to reading the information you're talking about and applying your wisdom? Or even better, what is the repercussion by not acting on the stuff you are talking about? I prefer the latter because ultimately humans are animals that like to avoid risk. Just to kind of give an example here, about half a year ago, I wrote an essay for my master's degree talking about physical inactivity and the cardiovascular system and heart attack risk and that kind of stuff. In the introduction in my essay, right at the start, I mentioned how many people will die of heart attacks each and every year, just in the UK, and it's more than you think. I then mentioned very briefly how physical inactivity increases the amount of heart attacks that happen. So in other words, literally, more people die because they are more inactive. Now, this might sound like a very extreme example here, but to anyone who works in healthcare, reading this information, they're thinking, oh God, I better pay attention to what this person is saying because it's actually relevant to improving their lives and reducing the risk of mortality for people in the real world. So applying this to your essay, and this can apply to any kind of essay in almost any kind of topic, think about in the real world, because again, it's applying your writing to a real world context here in higher education. For someone in your field, what is important to them? What factor is important to them, improves the working conditions of their work, improves the lives of others? What improves society, especially in relation to their field? What is the benefit to reading your writing, or what is the repercussions to them if they don't read your writing? And you need to mention that risk in a clear and professional way. Ultimately, the question you should be trying to ask or answer with your writing is, so what? So what? Why should I read this essay? How does the information you're talking about relate to the broader context of life and improving society? If you don't consider this and you just think, you know what, I'm going to mention a few sciencey words just to try and hit the learning objective of this essay, then there's going to be a bit of a disconnect between your essay and sparking interest with the person reading or marking your essay. You need to be tactical with the length of your sentences. When I first started writing at university, I thought, the more complex the sentence, the better. This is not the case. If you do this, it will just make your essay sound really boring if you make a sentence as long as possible. When people are reading your essay, they pay attention to the shorter sentences or to the end of a sentence. So being tactical about what I said before, if there's points you want to make that you know will get you the most marks or provide the most risk, put them in sentences that are either shorter or at the end of a longer sentence. Okay, this is a really big part of the video, but I'm going to try and summarize it as much as possible, but still be helpful to you guys. A big part of writing in academia is the word critique. You see the word critique in the module outline or learning objectives all the time, critiquing the literature. But what does this actually mean? What does it mean to critique the literature? And this was something that I was scratching my head about for a long time, and my understanding of this has changed since then. I used to think that critiquing the scientific literature was synonymous or the same as criticizing it. But if you look at the working definition of the verb critique, the definition is something along the lines of to analyze a process or thing in a detailed and analytical way. In that definition, there is the word to evaluate. To evaluate. It doesn't say to poke holes in it or to find flaws in it necessarily. So the real question is, how do we evaluate the literature? And to evaluate scientific literature, because assuming you're doing a science degree, you need to evaluate the quality of the scientific literature. And to do that, you need to have a good knowledge of the scientific method, because ultimately, when these researchers have conducted this study, it is the scientific method that they have followed. Some researchers will be very good at following the scientific method, and some will be very bad, but this is where you point that out. Here's the situation. I completely understand that for many of you, instead of learning about, you would rather carve out your eyes with rusty spoons than to read about statistical analysis and method design. But ultimately, if you want high marks, you need to know about these areas, or at least just have a rough understanding of it. For example, do you know the difference between a randomized control trial and a crossover design or whatever, and a meta-analysis. Which one's better, for example? Why is a control group important? What is the significance of the placebo effect? What is the issues when translating or generalizing information from a study, especially a study about rodents, mats and rice, to the general population? What is statistical significance? What is heterogeneity? What are correlation or R values? What are likelihood ratios? Because if you don't know these things, then your ability to understand the scientific method will be limited, and therefore so will your marks. Because once you become better at reading studies and understanding the scientific method, it becomes a whole nother language that you can learn. And I can tell you for free, some of the highest marks that I've gotten in essays have come from me understanding, more complex ideas about the scientific method and analysing the quality of scientific data and literature. Ultimately, this is a really broad area. Critiquing the scientific literature, this is the reason why people do PhDs, okay? Especially when it comes to conducting their own studies. So because this is a really broad area and because it involves a really steep learning curve, if you want me to do a video breaking this down more, then please let me know. While I don't like having loads of rules in my essay about how writing should be done, I think that when you're at school, you're told so many myths about writing, about how it should be done in a certain way. However, a structured piece of writing does make the process of reading a lot more pleasurable for the person reading or marking your essay, because they don't have to do Sherlock, they don't have to play detective to try and find out what on earth you were talking about. One of the best ways to structure your work, especially if it's a longer piece of work, is to use subheadings. Like if you look at the thesis from someone who's done a PhD, they've got loads of subheadings. So ultimately, if you use subheadings and the content within those subheadings is clear and meets the learning objective, you're basically handing marks on a silver platter to the person who is marking or reading your essay. The other benefit to using subheadings is that it lets you focus on themes and arguments and topics rather than focusing on studies. So a lot of students will write something like, Smith et al. Said this, Jones et al. Said this, Brown et al. Said this. But instead, if you focus on arguments, you could be like, while there has been a lot of contention around the efficacy of using, MRIs to diagnose this condition, there has been great advancements by X, Y, and Z. However, their promise or efficacy in these situations has been criticized by X, Y, and Z. So instead of focusing on studies, think about, okay, what is the essay about? What is the learning objectives within that essay, and what are the themes and arguments within each learning objective that I can talk about? And you will know that as you go on throughout the essay. By thinking of it like this, it helps you it becomes a lot more easier, to think about, okay, is this study relevant or is it not? Is it relevant to this argument or is it not? Because if you don't do this, I feel like a lot of students will look at the study and they'll go, it seems kind of relevant to what I'm talking about, and they'll just shove it in, and sometimes it seems very abrupt and it doesn't flow very well. So to give an argument about what I mean by themes, are you analysing the efficacy of, or just efficacy meaning like how usefulness, by the way? Are you looking at the efficacy of how an exercise improves this component of fitness with this injured population? Are you looking at the benefits of genetic modification to alleviate stress and discomfort or whatever from people with certain diseases? What is the argument or theme you're trying to discuss in your essay? Also, I think it's really important to mention that you won't always know all the arguments and you won't always know the exact structure of an essay at the start of it. It will evolve as time goes on. When I write an essay, it's a bit of a journey. As I'm writing the essay, I'm thinking, I need to go into more detail about this. Oh crap, I've missed this topic. Oh, this paragraph probably needs to go more towards the start. It's constant iteration after iteration. And lastly, to wrap this up, this might sound kind of weird because it's like a science degree, but think about the story you want to tell. Can one argument fit into the next argument you want to talk about? Because if it does, then one paragraph will automatically just flow a lot nicer into the next paragraph. Comparing and contrasting is one of the ways that you can, again, create tension in your essay. And to be honest, it just makes it a lot more interesting. If everyone agreed on everything, the world would arguably be a pretty boring place. And in academia, researchers love picking holes in each other's arguments and finding limitations. Take advantage of this when you see it. So to give an example of this, if I'm trying to compare and contrast one of the arguments in my essay, let's say one of the arguments is talking about weight training for children and teenagers. I could say something along the lines of, while physical activity has been useful for the development of the musculoskeletal system of children, there's been a lot of contention around the use of weight training for the bone development of children and teenagers. However, a lot of studies showed that upon analysing bone mineral density and bone and osteoblast development or whatever, it shows that the risk of osteoporosis and fractures later in life actually decreases. Do you see how me wording it like that is so much more interesting than just, this person said this study reported this? It just sounds really boring when you do it like that. In many fields, such as technology and medicine and engineering, the field moves very quickly in regards to finding advancements. If you don't keep your knowledge base up to date, as the saying goes, even if you're an expert now, you won't be an expert for long. Also, while research is constantly ongoing and the amount of people involved in research increases every year, there is usually a lag time between when a study happens and when it is published. Because ultimately, researchers, they need to analyze the data, they need to pass the peer review process to be published in a journal, amongst many other different things. And this can take a long time. It can almost take years. Just because you've read a study this year, the data could have been collected like 3 or 4 years ago. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, you should aim for data or studies to be contemporary, so in other words, published within the past 5 years, but data doesn't have to be contemporary if it does not exist. Again, just because it's original and new does not mean it's good. So tying this factor into what I said before in the video, if a study is new, but the quality of the study is really bad, it's poorly designed, it doesn't have a control group, it's really badly designed, and it could have been published this year, but if there's another study that's been published 10 years ago, but it's been cited 10,000 times, it is a really comprehensive meta-analysis, etc., you can probably imagine which study is going to be more useful. In this case, it's the one that's probably a lot older, assuming it's relevant, obviously. And if the literature out there is not contemporary, you don't have to find literature that's contemporary. If it's not there, state it in your essay. Say in the essay something along the lines of, obviously in your own words, there is a lack of contemporary literature that is high quality, or there's a lack of randomized control trials in this area, blah, blah, blah. Because if you say that, you should actually get more marks, because that is an example of evaluating the scientific literature. It's possible to evaluate an area of a body of knowledge by saying there's a lack of literature in this area. At the start of my master's degree, the start of my undergraduate degree, I found data within scientific studies to be either intimidating or just to be really boring, so I used to avoid talking about it. However, one of the most time-efficient ways to get marks in essays is to talk about the data within those studies. So, as well as critiquing the studies in general and critiquing the quality of the studies, what data did they find? What was the p-value? Was that p-value statistically significant? What was the correlation or r-value? What is the effect size of their finding? By just spending a few minutes typing out this information, you can get easy marks. But if you don't know how to do this, I will give examples down below in the description of this video to kind of give examples of how I've laid out data in my essays. Another easy thing you can do is, if you're talking about an argument or theme, like I mentioned before, and you feel like there is a table or figure, like a graph or bar chart, that really nicely summarizes the topic you are talking about, you can literally screenshot that graph or figure and place it in your essay and cite it by saying something along the lines of, taken from Smith et al. 2020. It gives the reader a bit of a break from just looking at reading words throughout the whole essay, and using visual aids is a really important part to writing in science. If there is a model or figure and you want to get even higher marks, you could add bits to it if you feel like it's necessary. And in this case, or you can just change the model in general to make it look nicer if you're really good at like smart art and stuff on Microsoft Word. And in this case, you could say something like adapted from Jones et al. And that's what I do in my essays. But clarify that with your uni in regards to your citation processing and referencing and stuff like that. This idea will blow your mind, okay? But if you are reading an area that has a lot of data in, you can summarize all that data in tables. Or if you are, as in like, you show the data from loads of different studies in one table. Or you can, if there's an area of knowledge, an area you know really well, and you feel like you can pass the most important parts of that topic into a spider diagram that you can make, please do it, because this might take more time than just regurgitating or reiterating what a study has said. But by doing this, it will give you considerably higher marks. In this case, if you're worried about, the lecturer or the person marking your essay getting a bit confused and thinking that you've just stolen a figure from somewhere else and haven't cited it, you could refer to your figure or table in the essay and say, the writer of this essay suggests this table or figure or something like that to help illustrate this area, so that the marker knows that you've made this table or figure yourself. So I'm going to quickly blitz through about 11-ish different tips that can really help with your essay that don't really fit into any of the other categories of this video. Firstly, when you're proofreading your essay, read it out loud. By doing this, it allows you to spot mistakes a lot easier, or even better, get someone else to proofread your essay. If you find you are a bit short in words and you went over the word count, try and use acronyms where possible. So for example, instead of saying coronary artery disease, say CAD, but don't use too many acronyms. Thirdly, when you're writing an essay, remember, be a scientist, be objective. Don't say whether something is good or bad, say whether a study has high quality or whether it was designed poorly. If you're struggling regarding the structure of an essay or how to lay out your sentences, just look at how other studies have laid out sentences. If they, especially with really big journals like Nature, Cell and Science, they're the big 3 journals. If their sentences are structured in a logical way and they've passed the peer review process, your sentences will be fine for university. Remember to use a relative amount of time on a learning objective relative to the amount of marks it gives you. So for example, if learning objective 2 in the essay gives you half of the marks because it's a really big learning objective, and if you're writing about like a 2,000 word essay, use half of the words for that learning objective. Use a whole 1,000 words on that learning objective, because you're dedicating the right amount of time for each learning objective to maximize the amount of marks you can. In regards to referencing, make sure you know what the university guidelines are. When you're writing an essay, please don't plagiarise and steal other people's work. Just don't do it. It's not worth, failing your degree. When you're writing an essay, scrutinise every single word or every single paragraph. Think, okay, can this paragraph or sentence be even shorter but still convey the same amount of information that I want to get across to the reader? When you are writing an essay and looking for references, especially at the start of your writing process, try and find a literature review. A literature review will give you a really good broad understanding of the area after you've read it, assuming it's a good literature review, and it usually gives you a lot of really useful references you can use as well later on. Try to use apps like Notion to plan and structure your essay, because it really helped me. If you want help in this, then let me know and I'll make a video on this as well. Lastly, despite all the advice I've given you in this video, if you're still really stuck, speak to one of your lecturers, and preferably lecturers that are knowledgeable about the topic area you're talking about, or ones that are just really nice and approachable. Okay, so this tip is for the keen bees who want to get the highest marks that they can. When you are becoming a lot more competent with your ability to interpret the scientific literature, and your understanding of the scientific method improves loads, and your ability to know a topic area becomes better and better, you will start to find gaps in the literature or find justifications or hypotheses that other people haven't pointed out in their studies. This is really good. If this happens, do something about it. What is the mechanism or theory that justifies the results of this study, for example. If something like that, if there is a theory or mechanism that hasn't been mentioned yet, which could justify data, say something along the lines of, the writer of this essay theorizes that this model could be a possible explanation for X, Y, and Z. If you can do this consistently and you do it well, I just don't see how you could be getting less than 70% of your marks, because it's this level of understanding and analysis that people are expected to do in their PhD. Okay, so if you've got this far in the video, then this video, and if your brain isn't fried yet, this video is about the structure. So how do you structure your title, your introduction, your main body, and your conclusion? So firstly, your title. You want your title to be as informative about the topic area, but as short and concise as possible. So I'll read out one of my titles to give an example. The physiological effects of aging and physical inactivity on the cardiovascular system and their relationship with myocardial infarction occurrence. Just from that title, the reader knows it's about the cardiovascular system and it's about physiological mechanism. They know it's related to the risk of heart attacks and, and stuff about healthcare. And I'm not even 20 words into the essay. If you are writing your titles and you are struggling, my advice would be just to read the titles of different studies, especially ones that have been published in like Nature, Science and Cell. Because again, if those titles are okay for those studies, they should be okay for yours. The introduction to your essay needs to do two main things. Firstly, it needs to create risk and tension, like I've already said. And secondly, it needs to be a funnel. So if you think about a funnel, it starts out really wide and then narrows down. And that's how the information should be written in your introduction. The introduction allows the reader to find their feet, allows them to think about how the information you're talking about fits into the wider picture. For example, if I were doing an essay about how sleep influences the likelihood of injury in sport or exercise, I would start off by talking about how sleep is beneficial in general. Then I would talk about how sleep affects the musculoskeletal system, or maybe even coordination. And then I would talk about the rates of sleep deprivation and how they relate to injury within sport, and probably give some correlations, and I'll give citations throughout the whole process. While you don't want your introduction to be too long, you want it to give the reader understanding about the topic area, starting out really broad and ending with a statement, a question, or a hypothesis about a more specific thing. So the main body of your essay is probably the most important, and it's the one that will give you the most marks. In the main body, so between the introduction and the conclusion, this is when you give your interpretation of academic literature in a third-person way, an academic manner. This is where you think about the themes and subheadings, and this is where you think about critiquing the scientific literature and, comparing and contrasting, as I've mentioned before. As well as this, you want to be discussing what the gaps are in the literature. What are the areas that have not been explored? So just to kind of give an example, you want to, one thing you could say is, okay, so if you're looking about how certain diets affect stress tolerance with certain individuals, you could say, oh, there's been a lack of studies assessing this diet, ketogenic diet, whatever, on female participants or on children or on elderly men or whatever it is. And you can then say the repercussions to that. You could then say something along the lines of, oh, for individuals that have like an anxiety disorder or females, for example, let's say there's a lack of literature on female participants. If there's females that have anxiety disorder and they struggle with stress, the fact that there hasn't been a lot of literature talking about how diet and lifestyle and stuff affects stress, these people could be worse off. Obviously word it in a professional and sciencey way, but you find out the gaps in the literature, and again, risk and urgency and stakes, mention what the repercussions are by not looking into this area or what the benefit would be. I've just made up that example, but again, as I've said before in this video, you want to talk about how the stuff you talk about fits into the broader picture. What is the implications of not doing research in an area you were talking about? The conclusion is kind of self-explanatory, but the conclusion gives a summary of your findings or a summary of what the general consensus is in the scientific literature. However, there's two really big mistakes people make in their conclusions. Usually, you're not adding in citations or adding in new ideas. Your conclusion should be a summary of the main ideas you've talked about in your essay. Secondly, the conclusion needs to have the most important stuff within your essay, or the stuff that gives you the highest marks in your essay, as well as summarizing what you're talking about. So these important parts are, number one, to start with, what were the biggest limitations to studies in this area? Was there too many rodent studies and there wasn't enough humans? Were there a lot of studies that didn't have a control group, or maybe they analysed their data poorly? Were there subject sizes limited? In other words, were there not enough participants to get good data? Whatever it is, mention those limitations. And number two, the gaps in the literature that you mentioned in your main body, reiterate them in a concise way in your conclusion, and to tie it all in a nice, neat bow, mention again what would be the benefit to filling in those gaps in the literature. Again, it has to be relevant to your target audience and who your readers are, or what would be the repercussions to not looking into this area. In the introduction to my essay, I like to show the repercussions to not looking into certain areas of literature because it sparks more interest and more intrigue. At the end of the essay, I like to focus on the benefit. So what would be the benefit of filling in this gap in the literature, or doing studies that don't have the limitations that we've seen in this area of study? To help out here, I will give examples in the description of this video in regards to how I've structured introductions and conclusions to kind of give you guys an idea of how you can do this yourself. This is probably the most comprehensive video I've ever done on my channel, and I've talked about loads of different things. So if you guys have any questions about anything I've talked about, please let me know, and I'm happy to answer those questions. If you enjoyed this video, then you might enjoy the video I did here, where I talk about how I doubled my work rate at university. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you there. Adios, amigos.